Marcos and Vittoria were a vibrant and passionate couple. Despite their short time together, the intensity of their feelings compensated for the brevity of their relationship. Both raised in orphanages, they found in each other the family they never had, completing each other in ways they had longed for. Samuel, their best friend, lived a different reality, surrounded by the love of a large family. Nevertheless, he never failed to support and be present in Marcos and Vittoria's lives, especially during their small disagreements typical of an intense relationship. As their first anniversary approached, Marcos decided to make the occasion even more special. He planned to propose to Vittoria. However, unsure of how to proceed, he turned to his friend Samuel for guidance. Together, they devoted themselves to choosing the perfect ring and the ideal setting for the big moment. At Samuel's suggestion, they researched hotels in paradisiacal locations, places that promised not just romance but an unforgettable memory. After much research, they chose an elegant ring and booked a stay at a charming hotel on the coast, where the sunset promised to be spectacular. Marcos was euphoric, barely able to contain his excitement while making the preparations without arousing Vittoria's suspicions. "Is everything set for our weekend?" Vittoria asked, noticing Marcos's extra enthusiasm while packing their bags. "Everything is perfect," he replied with a mysterious smile. "It will be a weekend we'll never forget." The trip started wonderfully, with the couple sharing laughter and dreams along the way. The traffic was light, and the clear sky promised perfect weather for the proposal. However, as they approached a curve surrounded by dense trees, the car began to have problems. The brakes failed at the worst possible moment. "Marcos, be careful," Vittoria shouted, gripping the dashboard. Marcos did his best to maneuver the car, but the speed and the curve were too much. The car flipped over several times in a terrifying sequence that seemed to last an eternity. When it finally stopped, silence reigned, interrupted only by the distant sound of a car passing on the road. Gravely injured but kept conscious by his seatbelt, Marcos tried to stay alert. He looked over to see Vittoria trapped in the wreckage, unconscious. Desperately, he wished for her to be alive. "Vittoria, please be okay," he whispered, tears mixing with the blood on his face. 3 days later, Vittoria awoke in a hospital bed, confused and in pain. Her mind was still foggy, but her first thought was clear: Marcos. She needed to see him, to know he was all right. "Marcos, where is Marcos?" she asked urgently to the nurse adjusting her for. In the quiet of the hospital room, Vittoria's anxiety was palpable. A nurse approached, noticing her agitation, and in a calm voice, tried to reassure her. "You need to rest now. Everything will be all right," she said while administering a sedative. However, the rest was brief. Upon awakening, Vittoria was surprised by the presence of Samuel, who brought news that shattered any remaining hope. With tear-filled eyes, he revealed the unthinkable. "Vittoria, I'm so sorry. Marcos didn't survive the accident." The words echoed in her mind like a gong, bringing a wave of despair. Unable to contain her grief, Vittoria began to cry uncontrollably. "No, this can't be true," she exclaimed between sobs. Moved by compassion and shared grief, Samuel took Vittoria to his home, giving her Marcos's ashes. With trembling hands, she clutched the urn. Each tear that fell seemed to carry a piece of her soul. As Vittoria faced her sorrow, an unexpected turn of events unfolded in another city. In a distant hospital, against all odds, Marcos woke up confused. He felt the weight of his broken bones and the scars from surgeries. The doctor, after assuring him he would be all right, recounted the story of the man who saved him and informed him that Samuel had already been contacted. An hour later, Samuel entered the room with a somber expression. Marcos, anxious, immediately asked about Vittoria. "Where is she, Samuel? How is she?" Samuel hesitated, the weight of the news almost unbearable. With a deep sigh, he revealed, "Marcos, I'm sorry to say, Vittoria didn't make it." With these words, Samuel handed over an urn, identical to the one given to Vittoria. Overwhelmed by grief, Marcos fainted, unable to process the harsh reality. In the following days, Marcos wept incessantly while physically recovering from his injuries. Meanwhile, isolated in her sorrow, Vittoria faced a lacerating loneliness. Standing before the mirror, she touched her belly, now the home of a new life. She was pregnant, a surprise she had planned to reveal to Marcos during their anniversary. The future, once filled with promises of joy and shared love, now seemed a cruel irony. Amidst her tears, Vittoria mourned the brutal reality that her child would grow up without knowing their father. Sometime later, physically recovered, Marcos decided to leave the city he had shared with Vittoria. Every corner, every park, every little cafe brought back memories too painful to bear. Samuel, always by his side, helped him with the move. "Let's go somewhere new, start fresh," suggested Samuel, though he knew that some wounds of the heart do not heal with geographic changes. Marcos only nodded, holding Vittoria's urn tightly in his hands. One last physical link to the love of his life, now lost in the fog of a tragic and relentless fate. Over the years, every corner of the city seemed to whisper Vittoria's name to Marcos. The park where they strolled hand in hand, the beach she loved so much. Exhausted by the persistent memories, Marcos decided to move to a new city, seeking a fresh start away from everything that connected him to her. Samuel helped him move, and with a hug, they said their goodbyes. Once Samuel was alone, a sinister smile touched his lips and a sigh of relief escaped. For years, Samuel had harbored an unrequited love for Vittoria. From the beginning of her relationship with Marcos, he had felt a constant discomfort, considering himself more deserving of her love than Marcos. He had tried everything to separate them, resorting to small lies that caused frequent fights between the couple. However, the strong bond they shared proved unbreakable, much to Samuel's frustration. When Marcos came to him to plan the marriage proposal, jealousy and anger simmered within Samuel. Outwardly, he maintained the facade of a loyal friend, helping with the preparations, but inwardly, he plotted with malevolent intentions. Samuel could not bear the thought of Vittoria with another man. On the day of the trip, he executed his nefarious plan by sabotaging the car, cutting the brakes, hoping to end the relationship once and for all. After the accident, he rushed to the scene, finding both Marcos and Vittoria unconscious. To his dismay, both Marcos and Vittoria were alive. Quickly, Samuel formulated a plan to make each believe the other was dead. He called an ambulance for Vittoria but pulled Marcos from the car and took him to another location, hoping to leave him to die. However, witnesses on the way forced him to change course and take Marcos to the nearest hospital. Samuel then manipulated the situation once more, providing each with urns containing fake ashes, making them believe in each other's death. With this, he imagined he would have a clear path to win Vittoria's heart. Years passed, and 10 years later, Vittoria lived alone, dedicating her life to her son, Paolo, the legacy of her love for Marcos. The boy was the center of her universe, and she had no interest in other relationships, her heart still belonging to Marcos. Samuel, still pretending to be a devoted friend, visited frequently, but his resentment grew with each visit. He couldn't accept that even after all these years and believing Marcos to be dead, Vittoria still held on to her love for him. The fact that Paolo was a constant reminder of Marcos only served to inflame his ire. One afternoon, while Samuel visited, Paolo played on the floor with his toy cars. Samuel watched, trying to disguise his discontent. "Vittoria, have you ever thought about moving on?" he asked, probing her feelings. "Samuel, Marcos still lives in my heart. There is no room for anyone else," Vittoria responded with a certainty that dashed any hope Samuel might have had. He sighed in frustration. Paolo's ever-cheerful and innocent presence was a constant reminder of Vittoria's love for another man. Every smile from the boy seemed an affirmation that Samuel would never have what he truly desired. As he watched mother and son, Samuel realized that despite all his manipulations and schemes, he could never win Vittoria's love. The truth was that she and Marcos, even separated by lies and miles, were still connected by something he could never understand or destroy, a true and pure love, now perpetuated through their son. While Vittoria drove down the familiar road that was supposed to have led her and Marcos to a celebration years ago, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. It was the same road they had traveled together before the devastating accident she believed had taken him from her forever. Now, with her son Paolo beside her, she tried to focus on the joy of sharing what should have been a happy moment with Marcos. She hoped this trip would be a good distraction for Paolo, who rarely left the house. Arriving in the city, they settled into a cozy inn, a different place from where she and Marcos would have stayed, but charming nonetheless. Vittoria spent the days trying to make the trip enjoyable for Paolo, exploring the city and its natural beauty. On the last day of the trip, as they walked back to the inn, they passed a man lying on the sidewalk wrapped in dirty blankets with a sign that read, "Hungry." Vittoria, her heart still heavy from the loss and the memories the city evoked, decided to ignore the man. But Paolo, innocent and compassionate, tugged at her arm. "Mom, can we give him something?" he asked, looking concerned for the man. Reluctantly, Vittoria opened her purse, looking for some coins. She knelt to place them beside the man, and as her eyes casually met his face, her heart stopped. Covered in dirt and with an unkempt beard was Marcos. The shock almost made her fall to the ground. "Marcos," she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling. Marcos, waking up at the sound of a familiar voice, blinked in confusion and looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment, he thought he was dreaming. "Vittoria," he began to cry, the tears carving clean paths through the dirt on his face. "Is it really you?" They embraced tightly, a reunion of lost souls finding each other again. Without hesitation, Vittoria helped him up and took him back to the inn. There, while Marcos took a bath and dressed in clean clothes she provided, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Marcos emerged looking more like the man Vittoria had loved. His first question was about Paolo. "Who is this boy, Vittoria? Did you remarry?" "No, Marcos. Paolo is our son." "He is your son," Vittoria said gently, watching as he absorbed the news. Marcos collapsed into tears once again, the emotion of the reunion intensified by the surprise of discovering he had a child. How did I not know? Samuel told me you had died," Vittoria explained, the sadness palpable in her voice. "He gave me an urn with your ashes." "I received an urn too," Marcos said, the confusion clear on his face. "Samuel told me you had died." They spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of years of forced separation. Marcos recounted how he had moved to a different city to try to escape the pain, how he had found a job but never got over the loss of Vittoria. Life without her became unbearable, and eventually, he gave up everything, leading him to the streets. "Every day was agony without you," he said, holding her hands. Together again, they contemplated the cruelty and miracle of their fate, now reunited not only as lost lovers, but as a complete family with the promise of rebuilding what had been unjustly taken from them. After the unexpected and emotional reunion between Marcos and Vittoria, the reality of the circumstances that had separated them began to settle in. Marcos, once a vibrant and full-of-life man, had become a shadow of his former self. Devastated by unemployment and the subsequent loss of everything he owned, he could barely get out of bed, consumed by the despair of living without Vittoria. Unable to find another job and still tormented, Marcos ended up living on the streets, where the harsh conditions were nothing compared to the emptiness in his heart. Now reunited, Marcos and Vittoria took Paolo back to her house in their old city. They went to confront Samuel, whose betrayal had caused so many years of suffering. As soon as Samuel saw them together, his face paled, realizing immediately that his plan had miserably failed. "You two? How?" he stammered, the surprise evident in his voice. "We know everything, Samuel. You will pay for what you did to us," Vittoria said firmly, while Marcos, still weak and worn down, stood by her side. Samuel, with a cold, disdainful smile, replied, "And how do you plan to prove it? You'd better stay quiet, or it will be worse for you." Anger boiled within Marcos, but his debilitated condition prevented him from taking any physical action. Samuel, unable to contain his bitterness and frustration, ended up confessing, "I did it all because I love you, Vittoria, and you chose him, a nobody. I sabotaged the car. I wanted neither of you to survive. If you couldn't be mine, then you wouldn't be anyone's." Samuel's words cut through the air like knives, but neither Vittoria nor Marcos had any way to record or prove the confessions made in the heat of the moment. With no other options, they simply warned him, "Leave us alone, Samuel. You've caused enough pain." As they left Samuel's house, despite the turbulence and lack of justice, there was solace in being together again. The days that followed were a mix of reconstruction and healing. Marcos, Vittoria, and Paolo began to adapt to the new reality of being together as a family. Marcos, recovering both physically and emotionally, did not look for a job because he wouldn't stay in that city. Meanwhile, Vittoria, feeling the weight of their painful memories interwoven with every corner of the city, knew they needed a fresh start. They began planning to leave the city where so many painful memories were entangled. It no longer felt like home. Samuel, despite being avoided, was a constant reminder of betrayal. Over time, he became increasingly disturbed, his anger towards the couple growing alongside his obsession with Vittoria. In his twisted mind, he still believed that he and Vittoria were destined to be together, unable to accept that she would never love him. As Marcos and Vittoria contemplated their future, the idea of moving to a new city became increasingly appealing. They dreamed of a fresh start, far from the shadows of the past, where they could raise Paolo in an environment free from Samuel's toxic presence. United by love and the adversities they had overcome, they meticulously planned their next steps, determined to rebuild their lives and provide a secure future for their son. Samuel, consumed by jealousy and resentment, couldn't bear the sight of Marcos and Vittoria together and happy. His mind constantly schemed ways to destroy the couple's happiness. One day, when Marcos and Vittoria went to pick up Paolo from school, an unexpected encounter left them stunned. Samuel was casually talking with Paolo, which immediately ignited fury in both parents. "Come here now," Marcos called out firmly, his voice leaving no room for protest. As Paolo approached, Samuel, noticing the anger on Marcos's face, quickly retreated without saying a word. Once inside the car, Vittoria turned to her son with concern. "That man, Samuel, you must never talk to him again. Do you understand? He is not our friend." "But he just offered me a ride, Mom." "It doesn't matter. Promise me you will stay away from him," Vittoria insisted, her voice filled with an urgency the boy rarely heard. That night, as the house was enveloped in the silence of deep sleep, a nightmare unfolded. Paolo's room was quickly consumed by flames. The boy woke up terrified and began to scream for help. Marcos, awakened by his son's cries, ran to the room and, without hesitation, risked his life to save Paolo. Together, they escaped the fire while Vittoria called the firefighters, who promptly arrived and controlled the blaze. In the hospital, while Paolo was being treated for minor burns, he mentioned something to Marcos that made his blood run cold. "Dad, when I woke up, I think I saw someone at my window." Marcos and Vittoria exchanged glances, both immediately thinking of Samuel. The next day, they went to the police station and reported their suspicions. But without concrete evidence, nothing could be done against Samuel. Frustrated and desperate, Marcos went to Samuel's house. Seeing Samuel's car parked outside, a dark thought crossed his mind. Sabotage the brakes, just as Samuel had done years ago. He approached the vehicle, anger boiling inside him, but as he placed his hand on the hood, he hesitated. He couldn't become what he despised so much. Returning to the hospital, he shared with Vittoria his plan to leave the city as soon as Paolo was discharged. Vittoria, touching Marcos's face with a tenderness that only true love can convey, assured him, "Everything will be all right. Please stay here with Paolo. I'll get him some sleeping medicine and then go home to rest." "I'm exhausted," she said, her eyes heavy with fatigue and worry. That night, alone at home and unable to find peace, Vittoria made a risky decision. She picked up the phone and called Samuel. "Samuel, when will you leave us alone?" Her voice was laden with exhaustion and desperation. His response was cold and cutting, "Never." The weight of that single word reverberated through her, signaling a threat that would not easily dissipate. The determination to protect her family, however, only grew stronger, solidifying their resolve to start anew, away from the grasp of Samuel's malevolent obsession. The silence of the night left Vittoria with a deep sense of helplessness. With Samuel determined never to give up, she knew their only option was to leave, to abandon everything in search of a fresh start, far from the threatening shadow Samuel cast over their family. With this resolution, she began to prepare for the next chapter of their lives, a chapter where she hoped peace would finally prevail. The morning after the fire that almost claimed Paolo's life, the hospital was bustling with its usual activity. For Marcos, Vittoria, and their son, it was a day of relief mixed with anxiety. Paolo was to be discharged, signaling the beginning of their journey to leave the trauma behind. However, the unexpected arrival of the police brought a new shock. Two officers approached the couple, who were waiting anxiously for their son's release, their expressions serious as they began to ask a series of questions about the previous night's events. Marcos and Vittoria cooperated, detailing the terror of the night, not hiding the fear that still lingered. After noting everything down, one of the officers looked at Marcos and Vittoria with a gravity that made their hearts sink. "There's one more thing we need to inform you," the officer said, pausing momentarily before continuing. "There was a fire at Samuel's house last night. He didn't survive." Marcos swallowed hard, shocked by the news. Vittoria, on the other hand, maintained a composure that bordered on indifference. "Apparently, he took a sleeping pill and forgot to turn off the stove," added the other officer. When the officers left, the ensuing silence was heavy and uncomfortable. Disturbed, Marcos turned to Vittoria, searching her eyes for some reassurance. "Vittoria, did you do something?" His voice hesitated, a mix of fear and the need to trust her. "Marcos, I promise. I just went home, took the sleeping pill, and came back here," she replied firmly, her eyes locked onto his, radiating sincerity. Marcos wanted to believe her, needed to believe her, but the circumstances and timing of the fire left a lingering doubt. Despite everything, he didn't wish for Samuel's death, not in this way. Time passed, and a thorough police investigation was conducted. There was no evidence of foul play. Everything indicated that Samuel's death was a tragic accident. The local community was shaken, but for Marcos, Vittoria, and Paolo, life had to go on. They decided not to move to another city. Life resumed its course, and they rebuilt their routine. Paolo returned to school, and the family tried to find joy in the small things of daily life. Marcos and Vittoria shared happy moments, but the shadow of that morning in the hospital never completely disappeared for Marcos. He loved Vittoria without a doubt, and she loved him. But the fire at Samuel's house and the circumstances surrounding it left a permanent mark on their relationship. Marcos struggled internally with the occasional doubt, a dark suspicion he never verbalized but that weighed heavily on his heart during moments of silence. He wondered if he truly knew the woman he shared his life with, or if the depths of her despair concerning Samuel might have driven her to actions he feared to imagine. Sometimes Vittoria would say, "You know I love you both and would do anything for you." That phrase filled Marcos's heart with love and affection, but at the same time, he felt a pang of uncertainty about the double meaning of her words. Despite this, they remained together, united by the love they had for each other and for their son. Marcos chose to trust Vittoria, chose to believe in the life they had built together. And while doubt sometimes haunted him, he strove every day to overcome it, keeping his family as his focus and greatest solace.